let's talk about Breathless. Originally released in 1960, Breathless is often considered one of the quintessential films of the French New Wave. Overall, it embodies the deviation from or parody of aspects of classic Hollywood cinema, which is characteristic of the movement. David Bordwell's analysis of the film in our text for this class, however, is largely critical. And while I don't really want to start this video off with my personal opinion, I will say that I didn't enjoy it that much either. Certainly not as much as other French New Wave films like Cleo from 5 to 7. And I will also say that I think David Bordwell's criticisms are a big part of why I don't enjoy the film that much. However, I do think that a lot of Bordwell's disapproval is not 100% justified, and that a lot of his critiques aren't completely valid. And overall, they don't really diminish the film's function as a commentary on CHC norms. So, while I do find this film perhaps a little bit hard to defend, I begrudgingly will be doing so in response to Bordwell's points, which I will be presenting right now. Bordwell's first and perhaps biggest critique of Breathless is the fact that the film's two main characters, despite obviously trying to mimic a film noir hero and femme fatale, often fall short of this aspiration and end up coming off as wandering, aimless, and easily distracted instead of determined, driven, and convicted film noir protagonists. The main example that Bordwell uses to justify this point is the nearly 25-minute bedroom scene in the middle of the film. Bordwell claims that Michel made no progress towards any of his goals in this segment, therefore casting him out of the mold for a CHC goal-oriented protagonist. Bordwell also claims that Patricia does not fit the characterization of a femme fatale because her goals and traits are uncertain and she doesn't play the typical role of luring the protagonist into some dangerous scheme. Overall, Bordwell says that just as Michel is ill-suited to be a tough guy, Patricia is too naive and indecisive to play the role of the classic femme fatale, and that these ambivalent, diffident, confused characters are unable to play out the desperately passionate roles that the Hollywood tradition has assigned to them. What I think Bordwell fails to consider here is that this is very likely the point. I mean, we already know that one of the defining characteristics of the French New Wave is defying CHC norms with a wandering, aimless protagonist. Perhaps in Breathless, Michel and Patricia are not meant to be Hollywood film noir protagonists, but an imitation of these characters. Even Bordwell seems so close to recognizing this point in his own analysis, where in his critique of the characters he states, "Godard's presentation of this story could never pass for a polished studio product. For one thing, Michel's behavior is presented as driven by the very movies that Breathless imitates. He rubs his thumb across his lips in imitation of his idol Humphrey Bogart. But he's a petty thief whose life spins out of control. He can only fantasize himself as a Hollywood tough guy." To me, this seems like exactly what Breathless is supposed to convey. A character who aspires to be a film noir hero, but would never be able to reach that goal. Bordwell also seems to criticize the pacing of Breathless's plot, saying that there are multiple instances of scenes that have little to no development that are played for far too long, like the aforementioned bedroom scene, and that scenes with crucial action pass too quickly and confuse the audience, like the scene when Michel shoots the cop that stops him. Bordwell argues that in the bedroom scene, which comprises nearly a third of the film's runtime, neither character makes any meaningful steps towards their goals, nor does the scene reveal any meaningful character traits. Interestingly enough, a different review from a critic from The New Yorker, Roger Angel, praises the bedroom scene for how well it allows the audience to get to know the characters. Angel writes that, "At the end of this, we have not simply understood the murderer and his girl for the self-destructive, attractive, and frightening narcissists that they are, we have, to a large degree, become them." In the scene where Michel kills a police officer that stopped him, the camera follows a line from his head down to his arm, to the pistol, and along the path that the bullet would take to its target. Bordwell criticizes the sequence's elliptical nature, claiming that these fast, abrupt cuts make the sequence too brief and confusing to follow, while also noting that it appears the pistol was never fired. Bordwell adds, "So much has been left out that we can barely comprehend what is happening." Given the nature and typically low budget of the French New Wave, I suspect that this sequence was simply a creative way to convey this murder without having to actually fire a pistol or have an effect for the officer being shot on screen. Bordwell mentions that rather than using Hollywood studios' typical three-point lighting, all of Breathless was shot on location using only natural or available lighting. Bordwell also notes that this sometimes causes characters' faces to fall into shadow. Additionally, Bordwell mentions the film's editing. He acknowledges that several sequences use standard shot, reverse shot cutting, and that, when important, the film does adhere to the 180-degree rule. But also that there are certain parts where the film does break continuity editing. In this sequence, we see Patricia walking in a single direction, but since the camera is on different sides of her in different shots, we see her moving in different screen directions between shots. In general, Bordwell seems mostly ambivalent to Breathless's deviation from studio techniques, maybe while keeping just a bit of the critical tone. One thing that he mentions extensively, though, is the use of jump cuts. In the film, there are several times when the camera remains in the same position, but the characters seem to jerk forward or skip ahead in time. Even when the camera does move, sometimes the characters' positions don't really stay the same between those two locations. Additionally, sound accentuates these cuts, as when the video jumps forward, diegetic sound and dialogue often remain uninterrupted. Bordwell states that this jumpy and discontinuous style of editing can sometimes work to enliven the rhythm of the film, but other times it just makes it harder to follow the actions conveyed and leave the audience confused, like in the aforementioned murder scene. In the end of his analysis, it does seem that Bordwell somewhat acknowledges the stylistic choices and deviations from the traditional Hollywood crime film, but then he goes on to say this. Godard did not set out to criticize Hollywood films. Instead, he took genre conventions identified with 1940s America and gave them a contemporary Parisian setting and modern self-conscious treatment. To me, Bordwell still seems to take Breathless too seriously as a direct imitation of Hollywood film noir rather than something closer to a parody. While the main characters masquerade as classic Hollywood cinema tropes, they fail to meet our expectations for these archetypes and fall back into what we expect from French New Wave cinema characters. Overall, the use of novel techniques can sometimes make the film noticeably refreshing, but also sometimes can confuse and even annoy the audience. I mean, in the end, a 25-minute long, slow-progressing scene is still boring, and because we don't get that much information on the characters, they're still a lot less likable to people. All in all, Bordwell agrees that the techniques and style of Breathless would go on to become central parts of the movement that it helped start, the French New Wave.